Hello and welcome to the Business of Possibility, a podcast with Ulster University Business School. I'm Wendy Austin. I've been a journalist for many years, and throughout that time I've been fascinated by business. And why not? Isn't it what makes everything work after all? So in this series we're diving deep into the world of business in Northern Ireland, looking at how businesses are staying afloat in the current climate. In the inaugural Business of Possibility podcast, I'll be examining leadership in a virtual world. The business landscape changed irrevocably in March this year, didn't it? Overnight, business owners and leaders across the world were faced with the somewhat abrupt challenge of managing and leading a remote workforce, as well as working out how to deliver their product, that is, if they still happen to have one. On the podcast with me today, we have Julie Sinnamon, who's CEO of Enterprise Ireland. Good to have you here, Julie.
Thank you, Wendy. Good to be here. Delighted.
And also Mark Durkin, who's the Executive Dean at Ulster University Business School. Hi, Mark.
Hello, Wendy. Hello, Julie. Nice to be here.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Now, I know that both of you have been enormously busy through all of this in a very different way to that which would normally have been the case. And we'll talk about that in just a bit of a moment. But before we get into that, Julie, tell us a bit about yourself, about your background and how you ended up where you are as CEO of Enterprise Ireland.
Okay, thanks, Wendy, and great to join you here today. So I am a very proud County Down woman. Grew up in Crossgar, and we were from a large family, and we had a family business. So from an early age, all of us spent time working in the family business. My father was in the poultry business and also had a car dealership and petrol station. So it was long before the child protection legislation came in. So as soon as you could stand up to hold a petrol pump, you actually took your turn on a rota and was very involved and was very interested in business from an early age. And then when I finished school, I went to Ulster University and did a degree in business studies. Spent a year in Dublin as part of that degree. And then when I graduated, ended up coming back to Dublin and have been working in Dublin ever since. And for the last 7 years, I've been CEO of Enterprise Ireland. And that's an organisation which is basically helping Irish companies to grow and to scale globally. So we have 40 offices around the world and has kept me very busy for the last number of years.
I'm sure it has. And for the last number of weeks, I'd have thought as well. But in how different a way, can you give us just an idea, a feeling of how different life has been in your job?
Well, first of all, as a CEO of an organisation with 40 offices around the world, a large part of my job is dealing with business leaders, is dealing with government, and a lot of travel, a lot of dinners and a lot of social interaction. And suddenly on the 16th of March, we started working from home. In fact, I was in the US when the government made the various announcements here to say that they were beginning to introduce restrictions. So we started working from home from the 16th of March, and it was automatically into a completely different world. We have been, first of all, the initial challenge was the staff. Did they have the technology to work from home? This required a big step up in terms of very quickly getting equipped. Then the initial priority was the safety of staff, because obviously there's a lot of concern about the virus. So it was a matter of putting processes in place to contact staff on a daily basis to make sure everybody was well because they were working remotely. And then it was about looking at the mental health of staff. For some staff, it was a big challenge moving into a home environment, particularly if they didn't have very good accommodation for working from home. And, so there was a lot of concern in making sure that they were connected, etc. But it wasn't just introducing home working for the status quo, because obviously this was unprecedented in terms of the impact on companies. So it was a matter of, from that remote environment, working to develop new offers for companies to address their liquidity issues, introducing all of these, and then trying to make sure that staff were motivated and engaged and keeping that connectivity going in order to be able to do that. And that was about really trying to connect people together, even though we were remotely. I would certainly introduce doing weekly videos to keep everybody engaged and informed. And people from around the world were sharing their stories as to what they were doing and the difference they were making. And in fact, in a funny sort of a way, what we found is we've never been so connected as we are now, even though we have been working virtually now for almost 4 months. And we have introduced a lot of supports to companies, and they have been very impactful in terms of helping companies at this stage, but it has allowed us to be able to introduce the changes ourselves.
It's an amazing shift that's taken place, really, isn't it? I mean, Mark, to move on to you, for many years, Ulster University's Business School has worked collaboratively with industry to support leadership development, among other aspects. And how are the business school responding now to this situation in terms of supporting business leaders through these very challenging times?
Yeah, well, Wendy, as you're aware, and some of the listeners may be aware as well, the business school works across all 4 Ulster University campuses in Northern Ireland, and we also deliver business into Dublin, London and Birmingham. So obviously the first priority was to make sure we looked after those existing customers, 5,200 of them. And as Julie has indicated, that shift to remote learning was something that happened virtually within 5 to 10 days. That was a dramatic change for us in terms of on-campus delivery, all of that moving online. We talk about being the leading provider of entrepreneurial education, and that's all about thinking and acting differently as circumstances change. And in many ways, that was a test of ourselves against that mission, if you know what I mean. So it was, now we have to practice what we preach and cope with this uncertainty ourselves and maintain business continuity through that disruption, which I'm really proud to say we did really effectively. In terms of the client side piece, we have a little acronym SOS, so we're encouraging businesses to avail of support to help them survive. That's our first S, then moving them towards opening or reopening. And then our second S is sustaining. So in terms of your question around specific support for businesses on the survive piece, we immediately set up a business support initiative. Various elements within that. We have a dedicated LinkedIn page for businesses to come and share experiences and draw some support. We've a business mentoring scheme that academic colleagues within the business school are reaching out to businesses. Very often, and it's quite interesting to me, very often those businesses not seeking advice, but just seeking someone to speak to, someone to listen, and just to share the experience that they're going through. So we've been heavily engaged in that. On the future piece, on the sustain piece, we've also set up a group looking at the future of business education. And we've populated that group with colleagues from America, local business representatives here, and probably our more radical academic thinkers, because for me, one of the things we have to think of is how we create a new model of business education, not just in terms of how we deliver. We've kind of been forced into that online transition. It's not about the channel, it's about what we're teaching and how we can help future-proof businesses given the dramatic environmental shock that they have had. So it's about a new model of what we're teaching as well as how we're teaching. So we've been working on that over the past 10 weeks as well.
It's quite interesting. I get the feeling from both of you that this new normal, I was trying very hard not to use any of the current jargon because we hear so much of it, but it is just a new world that we're in at the moment. And, Julia was saying that despite the fact that they're further apart, they're more connected. And this seems to have galvanized the business school perhaps into looking at things differently as well. Would that be true?
Well, I think... sorry. Is that to me, Wendy?
I'll come to you first, Mark, and then go back to Julie.
Yeah, I think we always like to think we were challenging of ourselves in terms of what may happen and coping with uncertainty and ambiguity and building curriculum and routes to market that were sensitive to that unpredictability. And I think it's okay in the abstract thinking about that and responding to it in environments that are relatively stable. But when you're faced with a dramatic shock that requires it of you, that adds a different imperative to it. So I think we've kind of been thriving on the excitement of that in a way, while at the same time trying to help those businesses that are obviously in survival mode and necessarily operational and trying to keep going. We haven't, over-focused on that. We're certainly catering to that need, but we think there's an obligation on us certainly to look to the future and see how we're going to do things differently going forward.
Julie, you wanted to come in on that too.
I was just going to say, I think one of the really different things about this crisis has been the speed of response that has been required from everybody, and the fact that everybody was thrown into this new world together, which has actually made it very different in terms of the success of it, because everybody has had to deal with it at the same time and develop and share their learnings and make sure that, going forward. And I suppose the most surprising part from my perspective is we had all the technology. We didn't actually use it. And I suppose when you talk about the new normal, a lot of the more traditional companies have been really surprised at how well it has actually operated. And it has opened their mind to the art of the possible. Some of the companies I'd be dealing with would have challenges with access to talent, etc. And suddenly they're realizing that if this working from home can work, well, perhaps we can widen the sphere of who can help us and make these decisions much easier. So it really has turned a lot of naysayers into really realizing that this is possible.
Now, that whole shift to virtual working requires behavioural and mindset changes, as Julie's just been saying there, both for leaders and employees, and some might say their nearest and dearest as well, if you're stuck in the kitchen or whatever in the middle of it all. But Mark, I wonder, can the fundamentals of good leadership be applied to that kind of digital world? What does good leadership look like in these times when, my son was saying to me, for instance, the other day, he's been working from his girlfriend's parents' home for the last 4 months. Lucky all of them. He was on a different island, so he's not here with us. But that he was saying that he had a phone call the other day with his global CEO, which in other circumstances would just never have happened. So, what does it look like in these unprecedented times, Mark?
Yeah, that's a good question, Wendy. I mean, before I answer that, I think there is an important point around us making sure we're sensitive to the fact that as humans, we're social animals. So there is something lost in where we are. Okay, it's not, I think, that this is better. We're kind of here by necessity, but there is something certainly lost in the social deprivation that we're all going through. The leadership piece, I think, is important, but where we have been, most of us, I think, in the last few weeks has been by necessity. So I don't make a judgment on this, but we've been necessarily operational and managing, just trying to get through it. Stepping back from that, my argument around leadership would be, yes, it does transcend channels. So whether it's physical face-to-face or whether it's virtual, the principles of leadership stand. And for me, leadership isn't about creating followers. Leadership is about creating leaders. So a more empowered, enlightened model, I think, is really important. The remote context we're in at the moment probably requires of leaders higher levels of trust, because direct supervision in the office environment may be absent, obviously, because a lot of us are working at home. And avoiding the temptation to micromanage, I think, is a really important thing. Trusting the staff to get on, and as you implied, Wendy, managing the work environment at home, but also managing the home, homeschooling, maybe with caring responsibilities. I think leaders have to be especially sensitive to that context in which the work is being done, and being more flexible. And I think that sensitivity and that focus on well-being and mental health, I think, is really important, and one that Ulster has been very sensitive to with our employees, actually. And
do you think, Mark, that business leaders have taken that attitude, have been prepared to be more flexible than they would have been perhaps if the employee had been in the workplace? Maybe in the case of some leaders, because they too are at home with homeschooling responsibilities or whatever, are they a bit more connected to the real world? Maybe some of them.
I think that's a really good observation. I think they are, because they're seeing the balance that has to be achieved for a lot of their employees in a work home the boundary between work and home. I think on that too, trying to establish workflows and patterns that are sympathetic to that rhythm, it is something that we've become acutely aware of at Ulster. And that's where academic teams, many of whom would have done a couple of days working at home anyway, but whenever you have to be at home all week and do the work commitments through that channel, it does present different challenges. And I think productivity has probably gone up for a lot of organizations by virtue of that concentrated effort. And I think one of the things leaders should be sensitive to in that respect is the temptation perhaps not to have boundaries with members of staff, who'll just continually work because they're in that mode and they're in their home office and they'll just keep going. And we've done a lot of work to try and make sure people understand boundaries and not starting meetings till 10 in the morning when they can have time with their kids and that kind of thing. So, I think we're learning as we're going on this, but I think from a leadership principle point of view, your point about being sympathetic to that and being more empathetic, perhaps, I think is a really important one.
Julie, what effective leadership practices and behaviours do you think business leaders now need to work in this new world that we're all entering into?
So, Wendy, what I would say is that I think this new world, it's going to be different from the world we left. It's going to be different than the world we're in at present. And as Mark has said, we are social animals, so it's not utopia. There are challenges with it, and that communication piece and that need, in many ways, we're living off the investment in the past in those relationships. And that's why at present it has worked very effectively on the task type of activities as opposed to the more strategic activities. But certainly one of the things which I think is really important in order to keep people engaged and to really get the best out of this new world is communication skills. And it might sound very basic, but really that connectivity and making sure that staff, it needs clarity and transparency about objectives. Actually, one of the things that there was previously was probably a little bit of stereotyping from some business leaders in terms of believing if you were working at home, you were sitting watching Netflix as opposed to doing real work. And suddenly we've all had to do it. And actually what we've discovered is that the issue is those boundaries and stopping people burning too much and burnout from staff. And so actually I think it has opened the minds of some business leaders. So actually being open-minded to what's possible, I think it's one of the takeaways for me. I certainly was probably more negative on what was possible prior to this big social global experiment that we've all been engaged in. I think the ability to trust, as Mark has said, the staff. Also, the awareness and the sensitivity, almost seeing it from the other person's perspective. So I think the empathy and the sort of authenticity of business leaders to relate to the situations that staff have been in. And I suppose it's been a bit unusual in this circumstance because they've all sorts of juggling pressures with no creches open, etc. So there's a lot of other things, and yet people have gone the extra mile and delivered. And I think it has done a lot to build the respect for some leaders in their teams that wasn't there previously. So I certainly believe it's down to the people skills, being having empathy and actually been really clear on objective setting and knowing what staff are doing. In many ways, it's much more transparent. Previously, people had said, I don't know what he or she would be doing if they were at home. Actually, it's much more transparent.
Tell me a bit, Julie, about the companies that you deal with and what they've been saying to you through all of this. I mean, how you've observed their leadership working maybe well in some circumstances and not so well in others. No names, no pack drill, perhaps. Yeah. But
well, I suppose for some of the young, and we would invest each year in about between 150 and 200 new technology startup companies. And those companies always would have been much more open to new technologies and operating in this world. But the largest group of companies I deal with are the more established traditional companies. So I now talk to companies, say, in the food or engineering sectors, and they are absolutely amazed at how this experiment has worked, at the at the fact that this work can be done remotely. They are much more open. I think it's going to have major implications from a regional development perspective, because now that people can see that this can work, and obviously you do need to deal with the challenges for the more strategic work, for getting people together. You do need to get people together at different times. You need to try to replicate the work environment in the home. So you need to share those successes and mark those milestones and actually put a spotlight on things and make sure that the communications are working. But actually, the companies I'm dealing with don't believe we will go back to where we were. And I'm talking about the more traditional companies. They see that this is giving them access to talent, and it is actually allowing greater flexibility for their staff, and yet the work is being done. So I think they're much more open, and they realise that they had been closed-minded to this in the past.
Mark, have you been hearing that as well?
Yeah, I have, and I suppose the overriding or perhaps underpinning dimension I think of this is mindset change. So rather than being defined by where we are, there's a really important piece around the best way to predict the future is to create it, if you understand. So I think people looking beyond where we are now to that new ways of doing things and not being expected to be told how things are going to evolve, but to challenge and to innovate around that new space is something we've been actively encouraging. And it really plays to that entrepreneurial mindset, coping with that uncertainty and ambiguity and being able to create opportunity and have the confidence to create opportunity in that context and not be totally defined by where we are. And that future-looking or outward-looking piece, I think, is a really important part of where we're going to go to from here.
And it's interesting, maybe a tiny bit ironic, but when you and I, Mark, first talked about doing these podcasts, it was before any of this had happened, and we had no idea that we'd be in this situation. And it was you who said that what you wanted to have the opportunity to talk about was the business of possibilities, which is why we've called it this. Yeah. And that seems bizarrely to be exactly where we are at the moment, even more so as a result of what's happened.
I'd agree. I think, you see, that way of thinking or way of living in terms of that entrepreneurial outlook transcends whether it's a face-to-face environment, whether it's online, or whether it's an environmental shock and a disruption that we're currently going through. And in many ways, this is the ultimate test of managing and creating possibilities through an uncertain environment, because everything has been thrown up in the air. And as Julie has said, for everyone's in the same place at the moment. But it's how we navigate our way out of that and create new value through what we're seeing that is the challenge. And certainly from a business school perspective, that's where we want to support business leaders and current undergraduate students coming through, to allow them and equip them to think about this in a new way rather than being paralyzed by it and wanting to hark back to the old normal. Those days are gone. And I suppose one of the biggest challenges and opportunities for us is to reinterpret the business education paradigm, if you like, all those textbooks that students will be downloading or accessing next semester, and saying to them, well, yes, that organizational structure, that's the way things used to be, but look at the remote environment we're now in and how we're now having to perhaps engage in remote governance. What's best practice for remote governance relative to the way we used to govern our businesses before? So all those things are being tested. So from an educational point of view, it's really exciting to reinterpret that which has gone before in the new direction that we're moving. But there's the other piece is that there's no certain answers yet. We're sort of learning our way through this.
It is undoubtedly an enormously challenging time, not just for businesses, but I think for everybody who's been living and trying to work their way through it. Julie, one of the big challenges for leadership is going to be managing the move out of this lockdown. And when you see the number of people who are just plain anxious about going out, never mind about going back to work. They're still worried about the virus. Their mental health has maybe been rocked a bit by all of this. That's all going to be a really big mountain for leaders to climb, isn't it?
That's right, and that's the task that we're currently operating on, because actually when we went into it, it happened basically overnight, and
There's no choice.
We muddled along. So now people, and actually there are two camps. There's a group of people who can't wait to get back into the office, and there's a group of people who are saying, why do we need to change what we're doing? And I think short term, as I said earlier, the task piece really operates. But when you get into the more collaborative, developmental type of activities that we would be involved in, and even, you know, when you're involved in negotiations which are difficult, if you're in a physical room with people, at times you can pick up the body language, you can actually see, you know, who is on board, who isn't on board, you can have sidebar conversations. It's much harder to do all of that remotely. So in terms of planning for the return to the workplace, I mean, the first thing is to make sure that we don't lose the benefits of this that we've talked about earlier. So it is about keeping that. I think there will be a higher level of flexibility. There's obviously all the COVID type controls that need to be built in to make sure that there's social distancing and all of those things. And there will be a transition back into the workplace, as opposed to just turning a switch and ending up back in full 100% back in the office. In fact, I don't think we will go 100% back into the office. I'm quite sure we won't at any stage. I think there is definitely a benefit from this that we need to hold on to. So it's a matter of keeping the flexibility, the communications. A lot of the things that we have introduced as a result of this, we will not change. So that much higher level of communication with our staff, both from me, from the senior team, within teams, across teams, it has actually been demanded by the situation, but actually it's being recognised and appreciated. I don't think morale has ever been higher in our organisation than it is at present, which is quite amazing. And that's been also feeding back on a constant basis. What's working well here? What are the successes we're having? Some of that is to do with business as usual. Some of it has been staff in Singapore out getting PPE for the Irish healthcare system, and just showing how staff have really risen to the occasion and made a difference and delivered what was needed. And all of that, you know, feedback to keep people motivated and inspired and connected is really, really important. So I don't think
quite a number of pluses that you've mentioned there. Just maybe as a kind of final point from you, how difficult do you think the next 12, 18 months are going to be?
Well, I mean, at present, in the last 2 weeks, 13 of our overseas offices have reopened. And even in that period, we've had to close 2 of them again and put the people back into remote working. So at the end of the day, I think there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, and businesses don't like uncertainty. I think there will be opportunity, because we are definitely seeing the stimulus packages that various countries will introduce in order to help their country. That will provide opportunity for companies from Ireland, wherever in Ireland, to be able to supply into. Actually, interestingly, the feedback we've been getting from markets like New Zealand and Australia, it's a great leveler. Nobody is traveling into those buyers, and our companies are having more success than they've ever had. And you can get to buyers because they're all sitting at their desk, they're not on the road. So there's lots of pluses as well. But I do think from a business perspective, global demand, the recessions in various countries, I do think that, and all the figures would suggest that there's going to be a tough business environment. And now more than ever, companies really need to make sure that they have a plan in place to address this, and that they're actually working to avail of the opportunities, as well as spread the risk of their products as well into different markets and new markets.
And Mark, what role do you see the Ulster University Business School playing in the coming months for those businesses and those places that you mentioned, not just in Northern Ireland across the 4 campuses, but Dublin, Birmingham and further afield too?
Well, you know, if you think about what our product really is, Wendy, on irrespective of what site we deliver that through, it's really about giving people a new perspective on how to think differently about opportunities and problems that they face, and also as a result of that, act differently. So that's really the gauntlet is down to us to think about new ways of thinking, what those new possibilities might be for different sectors. Our hospitality and tourism management department, for example, has just been ranked first in the UK 2 weeks ago.
Yes, congratulations. That was fantastic news.
There's got to be a way I can take credit for that. But in that context, how do we leverage that excellence into things that will allow the sector to get back to work? And it's that translation from academic into practical, from new ways of thinking into actual meaningful action that our record is good on. And I would really like to see us just relentlessly pursue that translation of new ways of thinking into helping businesses act differently, compensate for the uncertainty that they face that Julie rightly mentions, and try and move forward in the recessionary environment that we're undoubtedly going to face.
And you mentioned that you've had many calls from businesses, some of them looking for advice, some of them just want a listening ear or whatever. Keep calling. Is that your message to them?
Absolutely, keep calling. If you check us out on the ulster.ac.uk COVID-19 pages, you'll find a link through to all the resources that we have. It's not just mentoring and the LinkedIn pages. We also have aggregated and signposted other advice that's coming from different agencies, all in that one-stop shop. And just email the details that are there, Wendy, and we'd be delighted to help you any way we can.
Julie, it's been a real pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you so much for joining me for leadership in a virtual world. And thank you very much for listening. I'm Wendy Austin. This has been the Business of Possibility podcast with Ulster University Business School. Make sure you subscribe to the series wherever you get your podcasts.